Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Porijeklom iz Bosne i Hercegovine, rođena u Kuvajtu, a za sebe kaže da je Palestinka. Jedna je od najpoznatijih fotografkinja u svijetu novinarstva. Godinama izvještava sa Bliskog istoka, Afričkog kontinenta i Balkana. Fokusira se na ljudska prava, obrazovanje i reforme. O svom radu, porodičnom porijeklu i stanju na Bliskom istoku za Al Jazeeru govori Laura Boushnak.
Laura, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel. Now to start with, you have an interesting family background. Your family name, Al Boushnak, has roots in this region, in the Balkans, yet you were born and raised in the Middle East. Tell us more about the Boushnaks of the Middle East and your family background.
Yeah, I was born and raised in Kuwait. But when I first moved to Sarajevo, I was having dinner with friends and we ordered ushtipsik. And the minute I tasted the ushtipsik, it was for me like my whole childhood memory came back, because my mom would prepare it for us every weekend. And then I learned that she learned the recipe from my grandfather, from my father's side, who's originally Bosnian. So for me, that was my first connection with the Bosnian culture through the ushtipsik that puts me in contact with my roots, if we can say. So from my father's side, both my grandparents are originally from Bosnia. So a friend of mine gave me a document that goes through the history of the family. It was a group of 200 people. They migrated in 1887 and settled in Caesarea, Palestine. My father was born in Caesarea, and in 1948 they were forced to leave when the state of Israel was created, and they settled in South Lebanon. So in Caesarea they were like a community. They spoke the language. One of my father's aunts had broken Arabic. I remember in 1989 we bought my dad a book about former Yugoslavia, where he went on a second honeymoon with my mom, and they toured the area.
But did they speak Bosnian at home?
The older generations. My father apparently refused to answer back in Bosanski, and he would answer back in Arabic. And I think it was, they were marrying from each other. So both my grandfather and my grandmother were originally from Bosnia. But because of 48, they scattered. So, you know, they ended up in so many different places. And that's why I mentioned the ushtipsik. It's the little things that you carry from the culture. So my dad would understand few words later on, but no, they lost the language throughout the years.
So you grew up in Kuwait. How challenging was it growing up Palestinian in Kuwait, and how indicative is it of the struggles faced by Palestinians throughout the Middle East, but particularly in the Gulf region?
I mean, I was, so when my family settled in South Lebanon, in Tyre, they ended up refugees, and they had Lebanese travel documents for Palestinian refugees. And I inherited that, so I was born third generation Palestinian refugees, and that definitely impacted my education and later on my work. So for example, when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1991, our option was either we stay in Kuwait and handle the situation and go on with what was going to happen, or move to Lebanon, where the civil war was still happening. And somehow I'm a little bit angry with my dad, you know, because I saw a lot of my friends leaving, but we had to stay in Kuwait at that time. Later on, it impacted my education. It's that lack of freedom of movement. I couldn't travel easily. I couldn't, for my university education, I had to work in Kuwait for 2 years, and then I moved to Lebanon to continue my studies. And then in Lebanon, that's where I faced the discriminatory laws against Palestinians. For example, I was speaking to my cousin recently who finished business studies at university. And I was like chatting with him, what would you like to do? Or can you like intern at a bank? And he goes, it seems you forgot. I can't get any training at any bank as a Palestinian. Another example, when my parents lived in South Lebanon, my dad couldn't buy a flat under his name because Palestinians are not allowed to buy properties there. And as a result, my sister, who lived there for so many years, decided to leave because she saw no future, and now now she lives in Canada.
Yeah, but how did other Palestinians look towards the Bosnian community, Al Boushnak community living in Palestine?
It's interesting. Sometimes it can be also political. The thing is, because I don't look like a typical Arab, so people tell me like, you know, you don't look Arab, so you're not even Palestinian. You're from Bosnia. But for me, it was my identity is where I was brought up. My first language is Arabic. I went to an Arabic school. I identify as Palestinian. I held Lebanese travel documents for Palestinian refugees for 30 years until I got my French passport. But before that, on papers and my culture, I was, you know, I'm Palestinian and Arab. Maybe I don't look it, but it's who I am.
Mm-hmm. Now, you have an undergraduate degree in sociology from Beirut. Why did you decide to become a photojournalist?
When I graduated from high school in Kuwait, I couldn't go to university. I had to work for 2 years at an American school for girls. At the same time, I wanted to study photography, which was not available in Kuwait. So what I did is I enrolled with a school in New York, and I studied photography by correspondence. And that was back in '96, '97. And at the time, the internet wasn't as advanced as nowadays. So they would send me the courses. I would do my homework, send my homework by mail to the tutor. The tutor would send me back his comments recorded on a cassette. So it sounds prehistoric. And that's when I first started photography, I didn't know what kind of photography I wanted to do. So I started training at a studio in Kuwait, but I didn't like it at all because it was, you know, I was leaving home, going to a studio, I felt I was trapped indoors. Then after 2 years of work, I quit my job, took my savings and moved to Beirut, where I started training with a former war photographer. So the first assignment he took me to was a demonstration in front of the UN by the Kurds. And then the second one, he took me up in the north to cover a garbage dump. And I thought, on his motorbike, and I thought, you know, I like this job, and it makes, you know, perfect sense to match it with my sociology studies. And that's how I started.
Now, a lot of your work has focused on human rights and on the education of women in the Middle East. Why do you consider it important to tell the stories of ordinary Arab women and how education changed their lives?
You know, for me, reading empowers women. And when I started my projects about Arab women and education, titled I Read, I Write, it came from a very personal experience. I saw how if I wanted to move forward with my life and advance it, I won't be able to do that without education. And then I read a report by the UN which states that 50% of Arab women cannot read or write, which is quite a high percentage. And if we're talking nowadays of changing the societies and improving it, we cannot do that when you have half of the society neglected or not involved with the process of
What
change.
are the reasons for such high rates of
illiteracy? I mean, illiteracy is one of the problems of lack of education for women. I mean, it varies from one country to the other. I mean, in the Gulf countries, obviously, there is no issue of illiteracy because education is available for all. It's economic reasons. But poverty, yes, poverty is a main issue. Wars and conflicts is another issue. And
is religion an issue?
I wouldn't blame it on religion, not at all, but maybe more culture.
But quite a number of Western journalists and analysts will blame Islam for the lack of education.
Not at all, no, I disagree. It's more culture because in some societies, parents would prefer the education of boys over girls. It's poverty as well, so if there is money available, they would spend it more on boys rather than girls. So no, I wouldn't blame it on religion. But
isn't it a paradox? Some of the first universities established in the world were actually established in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Egypt.
And Baghdad.
In Baghdad.
Yes, it's sad when you look at the status of education in the region, it's quite sad. And that report, the UN report, which indicates why Arab societies are not advancing, because one of the main reasons is female illiteracy and lack of involvement of women with the change process. That was made in 2009. I mean, that's 10 years ago. And now with the situation, I don't think the situation has improved with what's happening now.
But why is it generally a problem throughout the Middle East that governments earmark far larger chunks of their budget for defense and security than for education, innovation, and research?
I know, isn't that sad? I mean, the why, it'll be very hard to talk about the why, but just if we imagine if all that money was spent on improving the facilities and schools, just spending that money to improve the curriculum of the schools. Imagine if there are more focus on reforming the education. I've visited so many schools because of my project, and the educational system is still based on memorizing information.
Why is that so? Why is there no intention, no desire to reform the education system throughout the Middle East?
I don't know. The question is, do you want to empower people to know more their rights, to build up more democratic societies? What are the students being taught at schools? Can we freely talk about votes and electing a president when we're talking about dictatorships? Would such curriculums, or if you teach these things at school, would it serve governments? I mean, these are some questions that we have to pose.
Now, a lot of media attention has been dedicated to Middle Eastern women, their struggle for equal rights and for full political participation. As a Middle Eastern woman working for a US-based newspaper, would you say that Western journalists have a very Orientalist approach when it comes to reporting on gender issues in the Middle East?
I mean, it depends, and I have to be fair. With the journalists I've worked with recently, they're quite aware of these issues, not to fall into these traps. And then when you see a byline of a journalist in some media, you have to keep in mind that there is a huge team behind them. There are, and usually you see the byline, but there is the other reporter or the fixer, who's usually is a local journalist who comes from the area or the country, and he would provide the journalist with information. But I have to be fair, no, I mean, it depends. I've been faced in the past with some magazines I've worked with where I would send them an edit of 20, 30 images, and usually there is this image that they always pick up on. It's a picture of a woman from Yemen wearing the niqab. That goes with the title, usually like Arab women and education. And it's these, you know, the misconception or the stereotypical image you have of...
But it doesn't change. It hasn't changed over the last 40, 50 years.
But that's where our responsibility comes. I mean, that's why also I believe I am being hired by, let's say, Western or mainstream media. They are interested in bringing different views. That's why also the media is focusing on hiring more women journalists and more women photographers, because the way I would look at a topic might be different than another colleague. And that's, as I said, that's where my responsibility is. But I can never approach a topic and think, oh, I have to take pictures to break stereotypes. It doesn't work this way for me. When I take pictures, it's, you know, because of my background and who I am and how I see the images in front of me. And I guess that's where it adds the value, or at least it offers a different point of view. But I have an issue, and that's quite a challenge, the coverage in Africa, in some African countries. Because when we mention the word Africa, I think we have certain images that comes into our mind. And recently I've been sent on assignments to cover some African countries. I was in Nigeria and Senegal. And that was quite challenging for me because I considered it was a bit out of my comfort zone. And because also I am, how can I say, not brainwashed, but I've been fed certain images coming out of African countries that when I went there, I was trying to challenge myself and say, what are the images that I want to see? What is it that I want to see that I haven't seen before. And it's simple. It could be just, you know, daily life pictures. I was in Nigeria last month covering a follow-up story on Boko Haram, and we followed the story of a woman who was kidnapped by Boko Haram. Of course, it's a sad story and you have to show, but at the same time, it's important for me to show how she lives her life. So I asked her what she does during the day. It could be just a simple picture of her spending time with her friends. And I think that's where it's important. There are certain images that brings misconceptions, but at the same time, it's always good to look for images that breaks that misconception.
But do you end up falling into the same trap of taking the same photos that you previously saw in Western or international media outlets?
I guess sometimes you can, but you try. It's the way you see things. It's the way you see. I mean, so I was in Lesbos last month. I'm taking pictures of refugees arriving. So yes, and the dinghy was arriving from Turkey on the coast in Lesbos, and it's like, my God, I've seen those images before. What can I bring more? And sometimes you just follow. It could be a small expression of a little boy, you know. It depends.
Now, you have been covering the plight of migrants and refugees from the Middle East who have been making their way across the Balkans to the European Union. Based on your personal experience, how have Balkan states reacted to the plight of Syrian, Iraqi and Afghani refugees and migrants coming to this region?
I mean, I would talk about my experience because I covered it here in Bosnia. I went to Bihać last November. I followed 3 sisters in Germany before, and I was in Lesbos. But here, from my experience and what my friends who volunteer, they complained that the reaction was a little bit slow. And I think the problem is still ongoing. But for me, what really breaks my heart, and I find it hard to accept, not just in Bosnia, but in other places, that resentment towards migrants and refugees, the fear that also politicians use. I find it hard to accept that refugees are a threat. And when I was in Bihać last November, there was a university professor who was trying to he was collecting signatures for a petition where he was asking to remove the refugee camp. He wanted the refugees to move somewhere else. But removing the refugees somewhere else does not solve the problem. And if we don't help migrants and refugees, what people are fearing will become true, because you need to provide better circumstances to people where you can, you know, avoid, you know, what they're fearing, violence and crimes and so on.
But how have ordinary Bosnians reacted to refugees and migrants?
A lot had help. When I went there, there was a lady who would come every single week bringing in clothes for the migrants at the camp. There was one camp which is a little bit outside the city. It's a little bit unorganized. So she would make a list, ask them of, you know, what clothes they're missing, what they need. Comes the following week from donated items from people from the area. But others also,
so there was solidarity among.
Absolutely, there was and there wasn't. You always have both sides. Definitely, there were people helping, donating money, but then there were these people who were scared of because one guy said, yeah, you look, if you see a bunch of 10 guys with dark skin working, you will be scared. I said, no, I wouldn't, but you know, I mean, what can you do?
Now, Bosnia and Palestine were part of the same Ottoman Empire 150 years ago. Yet today the Middle East is perceived by many here in the Balkans as a faraway, distant land. You've been living in Sarajevo for years. Did you see and do you see any similarities in culture, in tradition between Bosnians and Palestinians?
Definitely. I mean, it's what I tell my friends. I feel home, despite my 50% DNA Bosnian roots. There's no doubt Sarajevo is a very charming city. What I love about it is it's a mixture between the Arab world and Europe. It's not a completely like the Arab world, it's not Europe. It's that mixture that makes it very special. And I have to say, when I first moved to Sarajevo, for me, I love walking in the streets. And to feel safe, that's very important for me. And if I'm going to compare it, I noticed that there's no street harassment here, which for me makes it, you know, it's...
How is it in the Middle East?
It depends. It depends where you are. But yes, unfortunately, street harassment is an issue in some cities, which, again, if we're going to go back to education and we're going to talk about reforms, there are so many things that could be done. If we're talking about street harassment, a lot of things could be done by bringing that issue into schools and bringing awareness. And when we talk about gender issues and women's rights, which for me is a priority, it's about time that laws against women needs to be changed. We need also, it's important to empower women, but also it's time that we change the mentality of how men think about certain issues and how the little kids are being brought up. So if you bring in certain issues at school, where the boy can grow up to learn that, yes, my mom, like there was an exercise at one of the schools that I saw in textbooks, where it says my father can work as a pilot, doctor, engineer. My mother can work as a nurse, teacher, secretary. And I was, you know, if we change a bit that exercise and teach boys and girls that, yes, my mom also can work as a doctor, pilot, and engineer. When you change that mindset, it would, you know...
But this is not happening in the Middle East.
I don't believe so, no.
Why
it's
not? So it's up to the governments, or?
There are definitely initiatives by NGOs where they're trying to bring awareness to gender issues, but it has to go to a higher level where it's systematic, it's in schools, it's like you have to...
The various non-governmental organizations have been talking about the need to empower Middle Eastern women for the past 30 to 40 years, yet we haven't seen much progress, have we?
No, the progress is extremely slow. It's extremely, because when you have laws against women,
doesn't
you
it
cannot
have to come top down?
Definitely, definitely. You have first, like you have to have more women involved in politics. Why would a male parliament member ask for, you know, for the mother to have the right to get the nationality to her kids? My mom is Jordanian. I cannot get her nationality. Well, every time I travel to Jordan, I have to get a visa. But why? I'm visiting my mom's country, so I should be treated as a citizen. So there are certain laws that needs to be changed to improve women's rights. That's where education is important. That's where empowering women, that they need to learn how to read and write so that they could ask for their rights. I was in Amman taking pictures of literacy classes for older women. And I was curious because the age average was between late 50s, early 60s. And I asked one of the ladies, why did you decide, Ahmed, why did you decide to learn how to read and write at your age? She joked first. She said, because I want to join Facebook and look for a husband. And I was like, so how would you like your husband to look like? Her friend joked. She wants him to have blue eyes and blonde hair. the typical. And then she said, no. She goes, imagine the street I was walking in for 30 years. Imagine the day that I was able to read the signs in the street. It started giving me a different, the street started giving me a different meaning. So it's just these little things that her ability to read and write made that street that she passed through completely a different one. You get more connected to what's happening around you. And there was another interesting thing, the women in Cairo that I took pictures of, they were attending a 9-month literacy program. They know that they're not going to, you know, finish their education. For them, it was just to help them get by with their daily task from, you know, helping their kids in homeworks and other stuff. But they all agreed that they want their kids to continue and finish their education.
Laura, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?